Everyone to our LPO colloquium. I'm Brent Evans, one of the assistant professors here in the department, and today I have the pleasure of introducing our colloquium speaker, Adam Gamoran, who is president of the William T. Grant Foundation, who also has an illustrious academic career that's just ended recently after, I think he told me this morning, 29 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we are very pleased to have him today teaching us a little bit about the foundation and their work. Dr. Gamoran also has won significant awards from APAM and AERA, so extremely well-distinguished scholar, and now on the funding side. So we appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Brent, for that warm introduction, and it's been great to meet many of you over the course of the day and a half that I've spent here, and now to talk about the foundation and what we're trying to accomplish. And it's wonderful to be back at Vanderbilt and at the Peabody School. I have visited here many times before. I have some long-standing collaborators here, and I've been on many advisory boards. And so, but it's been several years since I've been back, so it's nice to come back. Now, I did try to time this visit for when it would be cold in New York and warm in Nashville, and I think I might have gotten it backwards. I think it's not any warmer here than it is out there, but it was nice yesterday. Anyway, so thanks for having me here today. First question: how many of you are on Twitter? Okay, well, if you're on Twitter, I would ask you to pull out your phone and follow the William T. Grant Foundation at WT Grant FDN, because 6 minutes ago we tweeted a set of resources that coincide with my talk. So if you follow the foundation, you'll see the most recent tweet is the one that is for you. Now I'm giving this talk at 4 different institutions over a 4-week period or 5-week period, and of course, don't want to do the same tweet each time. But I think you guys got really the most important tweet, because it's the resources that coincide. And actually, if you look down one tweet earlier from this morning, from when I spoke with a group of young faculty from across the university, not just Peabody, but across the university, there was a tweet with a link to the request for applications for the William T. Grant Scholars Program. So that's 2 tweets, 2 great resources for people interested in engaging with our foundation around research that's aligned with our interests. So my talk this afternoon has 3 parts. One part is an introduction to our foundation. The second, and by the way, I have to apologize a little. I've met with many people and I've told some of the same stories, so sorry about that. Anyway, the first part is an introduction to the foundation. The second part is about why one of our focuses is on reducing inequality. And the third part then is about how to, now that I will have whooped you up, energized and motivated you to do new research on reducing inequality, then the third part is on the mechanics of applying for funding from our foundation. So, the future of educational inequality, what went wrong and how can we fix it? So first, what is the William T. Grant Foundation? The William T. Grant Foundation was founded, amazingly, by William T. Grant. William T. Grant was a store magnate. He had what we used to call a 5 and dime, because you could buy things there for a nickel or a dime. And so Woolworths, Ben Franklin, Kresge's, these were their competitors. At their height, there were over 1,000 Grant stores. The stores went bankrupt in the 1970s because they overextended and didn't believe in catalogs, and also they gave credit to anybody who asked for it without checking them up very much. So kind of like not going online today, which is what happened to Borders bookstores, but I digress. Anyway, the stores went bankrupt in the 1970s, but luckily the foundation had divested itself from the foundation stock as its primary holdings by that time, so the foundation then lives on in perpetuity. Now, Mr. Grant started the foundation out of a sense of frustration. He was frustrated because he would hire the best and brightest young men to be managers of his stores, and some would work out and some didn't. And he thought, why is this? So he thought social science research on human development was the way to answer that question. He never got an answer to that question. He never found out how to predict who would be a good manager. But over the many decades, 80 years since the foundation started, the foundation has conducted many valuable studies that have contributed to our understanding of human behavior. The foundation has not been static in its focus. It shifts with the times, tends to fund work on what is viewed as the most pressing issues of the time. And so today we have two main priorities. First of all, we focus on young people between the ages of 5 and 25. The focus on young people is a long-standing, many decades interest of the foundation. And we recently extended the age range, widened it a little bit to encompass ages 5 through 25, the full length of formal schooling. So we have two current research priorities. The first is on the use of research evidence in decisions that affect young people. So the foundation's interests arose around a dozen years ago when there was a prevailing idea that the reason research evidence wasn't being used, especially in education, was because it was lousy. The quality was no good. So you couldn't trust the research. So who would bother using it and trying to make a decision? So if we could only improve the quality of research, that's what the reasoning was, then naturally decision makers would rely on it to make their judgments. So the foundation was skeptical about that idea. And the foundation wanted to support research on conditions that facilitated the use of research evidence in policy and practice. And it turned out the skepticism was justified. It turned out that improving the quality of evidence did not do very much to enhance the use of research evidence. And much of what our grantees identified was the barriers to using research evidence. But over the years since 2009, when the funding started going out the door, we have learned about conditions where research evidence is more likely to be used. And it turns out it's less about the quality of the evidence and more about the quality of the relationships between producers and consumers of evidence and between the intermediaries who knit together the producers and consumers. And so we recently, just last November, we launched a new phase of this work. And the new phase has two pieces. One part is to study how to create those conditions, how to create the structures and social relationships between producers, users, and intermediaries, and how to create incentives so that producers of evidence are motivated to respond to the needs of decision makers. So that's one side of the work, improving the conditions for using research evidence. The other side is to test an assumption. Those of us in the business of funding research are doing so because we believe that the research will shed light on how to improve the lives of young people, as our NPR tagline says. So that's what we believe. But is that really true? Has it ever happened? So the second part of our use of research evidence interest is in testing whether when policies or decisions about practice are made using evidence, does that work out better for kids? And that's an assumption that's rarely tested. We would like to do so because if not, what are we doing? What business are we in? So use of research evidence then is one of our interests. The second one is in reducing inequality. Of course, we're all aware that inequality by economic, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and immigrant origins is pervasive, and in fact, it's been getting worse. We have lots of evidence on the nature and sources of inequality, and there's more to be learned about that, but that's not our focus. Our focus is on how to reduce inequality. We're looking for new research on responses to inequality. We recognize that there is more to be learned about why we have so much inequality, why it's been getting worse, what mechanisms perpetuate inequality, but we're trying to fund work in a different niche The niche we're seeking to develop is a one that says, let's build, understand, test, and improve programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality among young people. And so the domains of inequality that we're looking at, the outcomes of inequality that we're looking at or that we've prioritized are academic, social, behavioral, and economic outcomes among young people ages 5 to 25. Now, you can think about inequality in a couple of ways. First of all, you can think about inequality as the dispersion of some valued outcome, like income or test scores. And second, you could think about inequality as group differences between blacks and whites, between kids on free lunch and not on free lunch, between kids of immigrant origins and not of immigrant origin. So our interest is in reducing the first and eliminating the second. It's probably not possible and perhaps not even desirable to eliminate inequality in the first sense of the word. Probably some inequality. Many people would argue, and I think probably correctly, that some degree of inequality is necessary to motivate performance. But clearly, we don't need as much inequality as we have today. I can say that with confidence because in the past we've had less inequality and we've nonetheless had high levels of productivity. So it's clear that we don't need as much inequality as we have, even if you take the position that some inequality is necessary. As far as group differences, there's no social gain from that, and so eliminating it should be our goal. Now, reducing inequality does not boil down to the problem of poverty. Of course, poverty is an important part of the inequality problem we face in this country, but we're interested in reducing inequality across the entire distribution. For example, middle-class families struggle to send their kids to college now because of the high cost of tuition. That's an aspect of inequality that is very much on our mind. So we're not interested only in lifting people out of poverty, but in reducing inequality, in reducing the dispersion of valued outcomes, as well as in eliminating group differences. One can reduce inequality by elevating people, by holding down people at the top, or by bringing up people from the bottom. And as you might imagine, only the bringing up people is of interest. We're not trying to reduce inequality by making things worse for people who have advantages. So, inequality is all over the headlines. Americans are grappling with income inequality. Inequality matters. In fact, it threatens the world order. There are many stubborn kinds of inequality that face children in the U.S. The Standard & Poor's says that inequality is damaging the U.S. economy. President Obama has declared that inequality is the defining challenge of our time. Even Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, has said that research may be, said that the inequality has long been an interest of the Fed, and advises that research may be able to provide evidence on which public policies are most helpful in building an economy in which people are poised to get ahead, and also to understand whether any policies may hold people back and discourage upward mobility. So we agree with Janet Yellen, or Janet Yellen agrees with us, that we need research on ways to reduce inequality. At the foundation, we make a four-part argument for why we have prioritized reducing inequality. First, inequality is excessive. And we can see that whether looking at our own historical past or by comparing the United States to other countries. Inequality in the United States is exceptionally high and higher now than it has been in previous decades. Second, high levels of inequality are harmful, both economically and socially. They drag, high levels of inequality are a drag on productivity and tend to fragment social cohesion. And we can probably see that going on, the latter going on in our political sphere right now. Third, social policies can combat inequality. Inequality is not inevitable. We can take steps to reduce it. And we can identify, and later in my remarks, I will point towards some specific policies that have restrained the growth of inequality. And so there are policies that can combat inequality. So if you accept points 1, 2, and 3, then surely you agree with point 4, which is that we need research to identify which social policies, which programs, and which practices will help reduce inequality. So we are looking for researchers to engage with this focus. Now, I used to think that I had a good fix on what would happen to inequality in education in the 21st century. In fact, I wrote a paper called A Forecast for the 21st Century. And I predict, now, in making this prediction, I forgot the wisdom of one of the most famous American philosophers, Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra said, "Prediction is difficult, especially about the future." Now that sounds funny, but it's more true than you might think at first glance, because in the social sciences we're always making predictions, but we're never actually predicting the future. We're predicting the past based on what we observed previously. So how much more difficult is it when we actually try to predict the future based on what happened in the past? So that's what I tried to do, and I forgot to be cautious. If I had only listened to Yogi Berra, I might have been more circumspect about my predictions, but so be it. So my forecast was, in 2001, I predicted that racial inequality would decline over the course of the 21st century. I made this argument because I thought there would be a virtuous cycle, a cycle where good things happen and then more good things happen on top of that, based on advances that had occurred in the 20th century, particularly a convergence in high school completion and a narrowing test score gap. And by the way, I wasn't the only one with this idea. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, in one of the affirmative action cases, said, in 25 years we won't need affirmative action anymore because there won't be a black-white gap. But now there is, so we need to take direct action to try to reduce this inequality. So Justice O'Connor and I had a similar idea, that good things would pay off now in good things now would pay off in better things in the future, and that would reduce inequality. I said by 2010 we would know if my forecasts were accurate, because this convergence of high school completion and rising test scores was evident around 1980. And so I thought the children of that generation would be completing high school around 2010, and so we would know whether the virtuous cycle had worked. So how do things look? Not so good. I made a second prediction. My second prediction was that there would be no change. In contrast to my prediction for race, for socioeconomic inequality, I predicted no change. And my basis for a prediction there was a pattern of persistent inequality that had been observed during the 20th century. See, I was a real genius with these predictions. I just looked at what had happened in the past and said, oh, more of this is going to happen in the future. That's what I did in both cases. So that was the basis for the prediction of no change in socioeconomic inequality. There were several reasons for this. Race is a protected class in the United States. There are explicit laws that forbid discrimination and guarantee equal treatment on the basis of race, not on the basis of economic circumstances. Second, we have ethnic mobilization in the United States. We do not have mobilization for the rights of the poor in the United States. So those were a couple of reasons why I thought persisting inequality was the right thing to anticipate for the 21st century. So how have things looked on this prediction? Also not so well, because by some measures things are even worse in the 21st century than they were in the 20th. So my plan for the rest of this section of my talk then is to talk about the trends in educational inequality, particularly since 2010, to ask what lies behind the numbers, and then to ask if there's anything we can do about it. More broadly, how can research yield evidence on ways to reduce inequality? As you can see, this ties in with the interest of the foundation, which was on we need evidence on ways to reduce inequality. So this is the one graph that makes me look smart. The red line is the gap between people in the top and bottom income quartiles. The black line is the black-white gap. And this is in the percent of people going to college immediately after high school. Of course, that's an important indicator because going to college immediately after high school is a good predictor of degree completion. And it's any college, by the way, any post-secondary education. And this line, does this work? Kind of faintly. Okay, well anyway, the line is at 2000. So how things, what's happened since 2000? Well, just as I predicted, the black-white gap has diminished from around 10 or 12 percentage points to 3 percentage points. And also, as I predicted, there's been no change in the gap between the top and bottom income quartiles in college enrollment immediately after high school. It's about 30 percentage points. And that's because people in the top quartile, almost all of them enroll in college immediately after. Oh, by the way, this is limited to high school graduates. In the top quartile, almost all of them enroll in college immediately after. So it's in the high 90s. And in the lowest income quartile, it's still in the high 60s, like 2/3 still enrolling in college immediately after high school. That's a big upward shift in a generation, but there's been no change in the gap. So this is the last slide where my predictions will hold. The rest of them, they don't. So here, for example, is the black-white gap in high school and college completion over the period of 1970 to 2010. So since 2000, there's been a continuing decline in the college completion gap. So if you go back to 1970, there was a 30 percentage point difference. By 2010, that's about 5 percentage points. So that's a massive social change. There's no denying it. But in recent years, the gap in completing college has actually gotten worse for the black-white comparison, where in 2000 it was around 16%, and now it's about 19%. Now, this is a particularly interesting period when the high school completion gap was narrowing and the college completion gap was parallel. It's interesting because as the high school completion gap diminishes, there's increasing heterogeneity in those at risk or eligible for college completion. And you might expect then that as the population eligible becomes more diverse, the gap would increase. But it didn't. So something very right was happening during this time period. In other words, the percent of blacks completing high school was catching up to that of whites, and yet they were not losing ground in college completion. So the actual rate of blacks graduating college was also growing concomitantly. But that's changed because now the gap in college completion among blacks has grown even as the gap in high school completion has narrowed. This is the gap in high school completion and in college completion by SES quartiles. It's taken from 3 separate national surveys, and this is the one graph that I would say I'm least confident in because it's hard to equate the data, even though there were similar measures. Nonetheless, so for what it's worth, rough stability over this 20-year period. So kind of consistent with what I anticipated. Then these are test scores. This is from NAEP, age 13 math achievement. And so you can see that the line at the top is a black-white gap. And although it has declined, it's a much slower decline than occurred in the third quarter of the 20th century. And it's a much slower decline than either I or Justice O'Connor predicted. Meanwhile, the SES gap has not declined, or even in the last measurement period has gotten worse. The figures for reading are a little more jumpy. It's hard to be confident about trend, but overall, the black-white gap again has diminished slowly, and the SES gap has either stayed the same or gotten worse. Okay, so to summarize the trends, black-white gaps in high school completion and college enrollment have narrowed, but the gap in college completion has widened. There were modest declines in racial achievement gaps, slower than I anticipated. At this rate, it would take 100 years for those gaps to close, so meaning by 2115 they would close, so that's a lot slower than I predicted. And socioeconomic gaps have remained steady in some areas like educational attainment, but gotten worse in others. So what lies behind these trends? Why has inequality gotten worse instead of getting better, as I predicted? Well, so there was supposed to be a virtuous cycle. So I had this paper in 2001 where I made these predictions, and then I worked with a couple of former students to look at how things were playing out in a 2012 social science research paper. And so the idea was that there would be a virtuous cycle that would narrow these gaps, where there would be improvements in parents' family background based on their own educational progress. And then that would elevate educational expectations, access to high quality instruction, and so on for children. And then children would then attain more themselves, and there would be a cycle where this would be compounded. Why has this not worked? Seems like a good idea. Why has this not worked out? Well, the first reason, and perhaps the most important, is educational attainment pays off less well for blacks than it does for whites. And this was raised immediately by Carl Alexander and one of his former students. So it was a criticism leveled immediately of our work. And so my two colleagues, Daniel Long and Sean Kelly, and I did some research to see if they were right, if the critics were right, and it turns out they were. Returns to parental education are about 16% lower for blacks than they are for whites. So that means that as the high school completion gap has narrowed, the payoff to the children of blacks has not been as great. So the background factors have gotten background differences have gotten narrower, but the payoff for the next generation has not occurred at the same rate. And moreover, this difference has been exacerbated in recent decades, and it holds for all levels of completion, from high school completion, college enrollment, and college completion. So the virtuous cycle is kind of a drag on it. It's not grinding through as efficiently as I imagined when I first put this idea out there. So why? Well, first of all, although high school completion has converged, on-time completion has not converged as fast as completion overall. And yet on-time completion is an important predictor of subsequent attainment. Second, the convergence in high school completion includes a lot of GED completion and disproportionately more GED completion for blacks than for white. And as we know, GED doesn't pay off as well as a high school diploma. A third reason is that even as African American families have become more similar to whites in education and occupational standing and income, wealth differences still prevail due to 2 centuries of slavery and discrimination. So even when SES, education, occupation, and income, are equal between blacks and whites, wealth is different, and that means that African American families are not able to translate their educational advances into the same benefits for their children as white families are. In addition, there are school quality differences, both neighborhood and residential and school segregation. Teacher sorting within and between schools means that there are quality differences in students' experiences, and so parents with higher levels of education are unable to confer those advantages onto their children. Now, if the lower payoff to blacks compared to whites has put a drag on the virtuous cycle, mass incarceration has shattered it. Did your question, Ron?
Yeah. One question. That last point. So part of the problem, it sounds like, is when we say that high school completion, it doesn't mean the same quality necessarily.
Yes.
So one of the things you could do, though, is take 2 students that were both from the same high school, right? One white, one black, and see what, so hopefully actually more than just 2, but lots of students.
Yes, you could do a school fixed effects analysis, right, to see whether high school completion for people who graduated from the same school pays off just as well.
Because that would get more at your point of the explanation, right?
Yeah.
If you still see a difference and they have the same degree and say even similar GPAs or something, then there's other issues going on than just the school quality. It's something about
Absolutely, and I'm not arguing that school quality is the whole story. In fact, I think I've got a whole list of things that are part of the story. So wealth differences, neighborhood segregation differences, a black and a white kid in the same school don't necessarily live in the same neighborhood. So, there's a whole range of factors that are involved, but that's one of them. So moving outside the realm of educational equality, though, is the mass incarceration phenomenon. As you know, there's been a dramatic increase in U.S. incarceration rates, and it's been more dramatic for blacks than for whites. Overrepresentation of African American males among the incarcerated. So the huge uptick in incarceration has affected African American males the most of all. And that, of course, reduces the educational attainment of the people who are incarcerated. Not only that, it has harmful effects on their children. Both cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes are negatively affected by paternal incarceration. And these harmful, not only that, to compound things even more, these harmful effects are especially salient for African American boys. And this comes out of the work of Anna Haskins at Cornell, who's looked at exactly this issue. So mass incarceration also likely contributes to the increase in single-parent families in all races, but especially among African Americans because of the overrepresentation of African Americans among the incarcerated. And so that exacerbates the race gap, which again spins the virtuous cycle into a vicious cycle, a cycle in which bad things happen that are compounded for the next generation. So that I believe is the story for the race gap, lower payoff of educational advancement and mass incarceration. Now, what about the SES gap? Those were supposed to persist at common levels, not to get worse. Why do we have some indication that SES gaps have even widened? Well, first reason is rising income inequality. There are many ways to depict income inequality. This is my favorite. It's a graph that has appeared in many works by Thomas Piketty, including Capital in the 21st Century. The graph represents the share of income obtained by the top 10% of the population. So if income were equally distributed, the top 10% would get 10% of the income. But instead, in 1917, the top 10% were getting about 40% of the income. Now, that rose through the 1920s until the time period of the Great Depression, when we went through what has been known as the Great Compression, a dramatic contraction of income inequality, so that the top 10% was earning between 30 and 35% of the income. Of course, there's still inequality, but considerably less inequality than there had been. But starting around 1980, we've gone through what Paul Krugman has called the Great Divergence, where income inequality has exacerbated. And one other interesting thing about this graph from Piketty is that if you look at the difference between the two lines, so the line with the open squares is only earned in open diamonds, is only earned income. And the line with the dark triangles includes capital gains. And for most of our for most of the 20th century, those two lines ran together. But starting with the 1980 divergence, those two lines have diverged because a big part of the increase in inequality has been due to unearned income, to gains on capital invested, which is a big part of Piketty's story. I've got a new graph. This came from the Wall Street Journal, which put side by side the same graph that I just showed you from Thomas Piketty, and then another graph they created from the work of Robert Gordon, who has a new book on inequality of productivity in the United States. So what Gordon's graph on the right is showing changes over time in productivity. Piketty's graph on the left shows changes in inequality. And if you look at them, you'll see they're mirror images of one another. The years with high productivity were the years of contracting inequality. The years of growing inequality, the most recent decades, have also been years of much lower productivity. A second reason for increasing, so the phenomenon of increasing income inequality means people who are in different parts of the income distribution are farther apart in absolute terms in the resources that they can bring to bear to support their children. So being a low income and a high income person mean one thing when the differences are modest or moderate, and another, or maybe I should say, it means one thing when the differences are big, and another thing when the differences are huge, as Donald Trump would say. These very large income differences have probably contributed to widening gaps in educational outcomes. So a second reason, and probably closely related reason, is a widening gap in how families can invest in their children. Now this graph is from The Economist magazine, but it's based on data from Robert Putnam's book, Our Children. And Putnam's book is about growing inequality and how we can respond. And this graph shows changes over time in the amount of time parents spend in developmental care with children aged 0 to 4. Developmental care means care devoted to children's development as opposed to basic necessities. It's not about babysitting or changing their diaper. It's about reading to them, interacting with them, playing with them. So time parents spend with children has increased for all income, this is by education, for all education groups, but it's increased more for the highest education group. So that's another reason why SES inequality may have been exacerbated. And a third reason is the increasing income segregation. So here I'm going to draw on evidence from Patrick Sharkey and his recent book, Stuck in Place, which is about the rise of neighborhood inequality. He has a number of graphs just like this. I happen to pick the one from Philadelphia. So the darker the color, the higher the poverty rate, the more concentrated the rate of poverty within a neighborhood. And so the top graph is from 1970, the bottom graph is from 2009. You can see the difference. And Sharkey shows this over and over again that income segregation has become exacerbated in major American cities. So that may be another reason for the widening SES gaps in school performance. So with those reasons understood, what do we need to know to craft effective responses to this challenge, as President Obama said, the defining challenge of our time? And after all, Chair Yellen said more research is needed, and who am I to disagree with that? We don't know, our stance is that we don't know everything about what generates inequality, but we do know enough to begin to build a body of evidence on potential gap closers. Our position is that high quality research, social science research on youth development can make a difference. Not just in education, by the way, in areas such as the workforce transition, immigration, child welfare and mental health, and the justice system. And these are areas that we have prioritized, that we've tried to call attention to, because we think these are ripe for new research on ways to reduce inequality. We think these are areas where we know enough about the causes of inequality to begin to build, test, and improve responses to inequality. So, for example, post-secondary education and workforce transition. Now here, we commissioned a paper, and the links to these 4 papers that I'm going to show you, they're in the tweet that we sent out at 3 o'clock, or 2:30. So this, we commissioned a paper from Jim Rosenbaum at Northwestern, and we asked him to comment on workforce transition and post-secondary education today in light of a report produced by the William T. Grant Foundation in 1988. So 27 years ago, the foundation produced a report called The Forgotten Half. It was about our national underinvestment in young people who do not go to college. At that time, about 50% of our population went to college, and there's a big public investment in those who go to college. And the other 50% didn't go to college, and there's virtually no public investment in those people, especially at that time. So that was the point of the forgotten half. We're wasting this opportunity to invest in half of our population. So we asked Rosenbaum to investigate who are the forgotten half of today. So he wrote a paper called The New Forgotten Half. and research directions to support them. And his argument is that the forgotten half of today are people who attend but don't complete college. So today, a very large fraction, 87% of high school graduates attend some form of post-secondary completion. Even among the low SES quartiles I mentioned earlier, 2/3 attend some form of post-secondary education. But half of them get nothing out of it. No degree, no certification, no qualification, and either little, Rosenbaum says no benefit on the labor market. Some others have said only a little benefit on the labor market. Anyway, it's not much of a labor market payoff for some college if you don't get a degree. The only thing they do get is debt. So they reap no rewards. And so this leads to a new research agenda that Rosenbaum has called out that describes the new college reality and studies improvements in the articulation between secondary and post-secondary education and the workforce through improvements in high school and college counseling, and showed how to improve the links between high school, college, and the workforce. Now, financial support is part of the story. We hear a lot about free college. Here in Tennessee, you have pioneered the free community college. And some people read this report that we commissioned and say, we don't need free college. Access isn't the problem. Everybody's going to college. What do we need free community college? Well, it turns out that when you ask people why they didn't complete college, the number one reason they give is financial struggles. So it could be that the free college movement will prove to be consequential because it will at least take away part of that financial burden. Now, the other part is that they have to work full time so they can support themselves while they're in college. So it's not clear that free tuition is enough. Some would argue that you need free tuition and the Pell Grant so you can live on the Pell Grant and not have to pay the college. But anyway, so financial assistance is part of the story, even though in our view, in my view, it's not an access story, it's a completion story. So with respect to immigrant children and families, we commissioned another paper by Carola Suarez Orozco and Vivian Tseng, who's our vice president, and Hiro Yoshikawa at NYU. So this is, they call it Intersecting Inequalities, because their argument is that inequality that immigrants face is not about immigration per se, it's about the many conditions that are tied to the immigrant status. So it's the context of immigration that intersect to generate inequality. Poverty, newcomer status, language barriers, undocumented status, all of these conditions when taken together make it more difficult for immigrants to succeed in our academic and economic systems than for native-born Americans. Family and education provide a context for alleviating inequality, and so this leads to a pressing research agenda in which inequality is a core concern rather than left at the periphery. And we can study specific policy efforts such as deferred action for childhood arrivals, the DACA policy, under which children who were undocumented but were brought as young children have had, under President Obama, have had their deportation status set aside. So how has that played out with respect to immigrant progress? We need to avoid a deficit framework in thinking about being an immigrant as something you're missing, and rather think about it as something you have, cultural resources that you can bring to bear on your success. So inequality confronting immigrants is another area where we'd like to see research and support research. Mental health and mental health services is yet another area. We asked Margarita Alegria, a Harvard Med School professor, to provide a paper for us on this topic. And here she shows that mental health disparities both contribute to and are a reflection of educational inequality. So in part, educational inequality generates mental health differences. In part, educational inequality exists because of mental health differences. Childhood adversities such as poverty and homelessness contribute to mental health, in some cases because they trigger vulnerabilities to mental health difficulties. And so here again we have a call out for new research that will study key periods of risk, that will focus on ways to reduce childhood adversities and that will target mechanisms in families, in schools, and in communities. Our fourth area in which we have tried to call out for new research is justice systems, juvenile and criminal justice. We're interested in both juvenile and criminal justice system because our age range goes from 5 to 25. Juvenile justice is through age 18. Criminal justice post age 18. So John Laub, who's a former director of the National Institutes for Justice, did a paper for us on understanding inequality in the justice system and a way to move forward. Of course, inequality in the justice system is on all of our minds these days with the horrible conditions that exist in our cities, police interactions with young people especially, which it's not like this is a new phenomenon, but the exposure of this phenomenon to the light of day is new, especially through videotaping, whether through official means or through bystanders. So we've recognized this as a domain of inequality. It's on all of our minds. And is closely bound up, Laub argues, closely bound up with educational inequality, again, both as a contributor to and a reflection of educational inequality. So Laub calls for new research to help break the school to prison pipeline, meaning failure in school leading to incarceration. Research that will implement and study new police practices, new ways that police can interact with young people to try to avoid some of the terrible events that we've witnessed recently. Change patterns of thinking, reduce the impact of implicit bias. One of our recently graduated William T. Grant scholars, Philip Goff, has shown in a new paper how African American boys are not afforded the advantages of childhood. So they are seen as men instead of boys at the same age. So two young people of a similar age, white and black, the white kid is seen as, oh, that's a kid, and his behavior can be excused. The black kid is seen as, oh, he needs to be held accountable. So this may account for some of the disparities we see in police interactions with young people. So that's what I mean by change patterns of thinking. And then reducing, Laub makes the point that, look, the inequalities in the justice system are not just about the justice system. They're about inequality in many realms in society, economic inequality, educational inequality. And we can't think that we're going to eliminate inequality in the justice system unless we attack it more broadly. Okay, so in today's rhetoric, inequality in some ways seems inevitable. That was certainly Piketty's argument. Returns to capital exceed returns to income. In other words, you get a bigger growth in your resources if you have stuff that you can invest than you do if you just work for a living. So if that's the case, then inequality will grow inexorably, right? That means rich will get richer, and there's no way that people who aren't rich can catch up. Similarly, Gordon has pointed to the anemic growth in productivity, and both of these findings suggest that inequality is bound to grow. And yet, inequality also responds to institutions, and institutions are amenable to policy. So it's our standpoint that inequality is not inevitable. Now, I took this photograph. I was not there in 1965 when the War on Poverty was signed. I hope you recognize some of the figures there. President Johnson, flanked by Martin Luther King and others. But I took this photograph the last time I saw Carolyn Heinrich in Austin, Texas, when I visited the Johnson Library. And they have a big life-size version of this photo. So the War on Poverty is a great example of how social policy can mitigate inequality. Now, the war on poverty has not been won. We still have poverty. But it's demonstrable that poverty would be worse without the policies enacted by the war on poverty. And our colleagues at the Russell Sage Foundation have done a good job of showing how policies like food stamps, school lunches, the earned income tax credit, housing, and unemployment assistance have prevented poverty from being as bad as it would be otherwise. So other programs, policies, and practices have shown demonstrated effects on reducing inequality among young people. High-quality early child care programs, programs that promote healthy parenting, family school engagement programs, small classes in the earliest elementary grades. social psychological interventions enacted to reduce stereotype threat and help buffer children from disadvantaged origins from internalizing those pernicious attitudes. Financial aid assistance at the post-secondary level. Each of these is a policy or a program that's been successfully enacted and been demonstrated to reduce inequality. So clearly we're not paralyzed. The constraints of disadvantage are not unbreakable. Now, if all those programs work, why the growth in inequality? Well, unfortunately, although effective responses have emerged, they are modest compared to the vast scope of the problem. Moreover, programs need time to take their effects, and often we don't let them last long enough for their effects to be manifested. School reforms, for example, in a well-known paper by Jeffrey Borman and Maritza Dowling, take 3 to 5 years before you see any improvement. Early childhood programs often don't manifest their effects for decades after the intervention took place. And so you need patience to see these effects arise. Moreover, there's a need for multiple efforts across multiple spheres. It's a mistake to think that schools can solve the problems alone. We need efforts across family, healthcare, neighborhoods, schools, workforce. All of these need to be affected at the same time. Programs, policies, and practices work differently for different persons and in different circumstances. And we need research that's sensitive to these nuances in order to figure out how to put together a comprehensive package of efforts to reduce inequality on a broad basis. Oh, when I bought a house, I was told there were 3 important things that you need to know about buying a house. Location, location, and location. So what I've learned in 30 years of social science research is that there are 3 things that are important about effective programs, and they are implementation, implementation, and implementation. So another reason why, even though we know a lot of effective programs and policies, we still have rising inequality, is that it's difficult to implement these programs effectively at a large scale. So the William T. Grant Foundation wants to help. Now, there are probably 1,000 foundations that are interested in reducing inequalities, but there are some features of our approach, some hallmarks of our approach that are distinctive. First, we support research. So that probably cuts out 975 of the 1,000 foundations. In addition to that, we focus on young people. In the long run, we aim that the research we support should lead to some action. We recognize, so as I said before, we want to build, test, and understand and improve programs, policies, and practices. So we understand that no single study is likely to be transformative, but our goal is to fund a body of work that over time will accumulate to result in real social change. In addition, a feature of our work is that we're supporting tools that can help many researchers. So in our previous interest, which was on understanding and improving the social settings or environment where young people develop, we contributed to new research on methods for analysis of data from cluster randomized trials that have had a big influence on the way work is conducted in that domain. In our new focus on inequality, we're helping to create data systems, one on school finance inequality, one on achievement test inequality, and there will we have others in mind, and so watch this space for further development. So creating key resources that help many researchers is another one of our aims. And in addition, we're distinctive in our interdisciplinary portfolio. Many of the studies that we support are themselves interdisciplinary, and if you look across our portfolio of work, we support work from sociology, psychology, economics, political science, social welfare, so we have very much an interdisciplinary portfolio. So we seek researchers to answer this call. And so how can you do that? Well, I'm about to tell you. As I mentioned in one of my first slides, we choose our research interests based on the pressing issues of the day. We begin with a set of questions, not preconceptions. You know, there are some foundations that say, we have the answer, and we want to support research on how to do this answer. Our approach is different. We say, we've identified a problem, but we're not smart enough to know the answers. We need the research community to propose the answers. And then we want to support that work to figure out if, and so you need to come up with answers that are compelling to us and to external reviewers. And if they are compelling, then we want to fund you so that you can test whether those answers work. And we favor an interdisciplinary approach to research, as I mentioned. We offer 4 different types of grants, 2 of which I think will be of interest to you, but I'll just mention all 4 of them. First, our major research grants. Second, our William T. Grant Distinguished Fellows, which give either researchers a year to spend in a policy or practice setting, and policymakers and practitioners a fellowship to spend a year in a research setting. Then the William T. Grant Scholars, and I had a chance to talk with a group of early career scholars here this morning about the program. And finally, the Youth Service Improvement Grants, which are a set of small grants in New York for youth serving organizations in New York City. So the major research grants. So these grants are awarded in 2 phases. First, applicants have to go through 2 phases to get these grants. The first is a letter of inquiry. It's a 5-page letter of inquiry, so not a high burden. There are 3 deadlines a year in January, May, and August. Within about 4 to 6 weeks, you'll hear back as to whether you're invited to submit a full proposal. About 15% of the letters of inquiry generate an invitation for a full proposal. We review those internally to see, and so the basis for the criteria for the internal review are they aligned with our focus, and do they fit the funding criteria, the kind of work we're interested in funding. Then the full proposal, so if you're invited to submit a full proposal, that goes out for external review, and then we review it internally, and some fraction of the full proposals then generate a set of questions, and the investigator gets a chance to respond to those questions. And then when the response is successful, then so ultimately about a third of the full proposals are recommended to our Board of Trustees for funding, and those are generally funded. So the board meetings occur in March, June, and October, and that's when the funding decisions are made. The William T. Grant Scholars Program is for early career scholars within 7 years of the PhD. You have to be in a career ladder position, so assistant professors, yes. Postdocs, no. You have to be nominated by your institution, so you can't apply on your own. The institution has to nominate you, and a major division of institution, like the Peabody School or the College of Arts and Sciences, can nominate only 1 candidate per year. So there could be 2 nominees from Vanderbilt, 1 from Arts and Sciences and 1 from Peabody. So many institutions have internal competitions to decide who their nominee in a given year is going to be. The awards provide, so the William T. Scholars Grant is not a grant for doing a specific piece of work. It's a career development award, and it provides 5 years of funding. You have to provide a research plan that shows how you're going to grow and do kinds of work that you wouldn't otherwise have done. And you need to have identified specific mentors who will help you move into that new area, do that new work. It says guidelines published in December, but actually it came out last week. But they're out now, and the application deadline is in July. And we need to give a lot of lead time, both so institutions can decide who their nominee is going to be, and because it's a long and arduous proposal and need a lot of time to prepare it. It's not something that can be done quickly. So if you're interested, take a look at the RFP. As I mentioned, it's on our website or in a tweet that was tweeted at 8:01 a.m. this morning. The Distinguished Fellows, as I mentioned, is to bridge the gap between policy and practice by taking practitioners and immersing them in a research setting, or vice versa. And so this is a mid-career award. You need to be between 8 and 20 years post-PhD. The awards provide fellowships that can be of 6 months to 2 years duration. The rest I've said. So I'll leave it at that and invite your questions or comments, either further comments on the substantive part of the remarks, or your questions or comments on the logistics of how to compete for funding from our foundation. Ron?
Yeah, so the 4 areas you mentioned, so one of the things you said that could create this inequality is neighborhoods, right?
Yes.
So we segregate ourselves into different neighborhoods based on race, based on income. But I didn't see that explicitly mentioned as a research focus.
Yeah, I didn't call it out, but we're absolutely very interested in that. In fact, we have a grant that we've already made to Sandra Newman to look at subsidized housing and its payoff for children. So there's a lot of research on subsidized housing and how it affects families, but very little that looks at the implications for children. And so we're interested in that. Patrick Sharkey is a William T. Grant Scholar, so we're supporting his work. And I believe we will be if I'm not mistaken, in March we will be recommending to our Board of Trustees another proposal in the housing area, which I won't name because I have to see if it gets approved by the board. So we're very interested in that. Now, as far as neighborhood effects research, we'd be interested in that, but you've got to have a component that says, here's a policy or a program to reduce inequality. It can't just be, does neighborhood segregation reduce children's outcomes? Well, our stance is we know enough about that to focus on specific efforts to reduce inequality. So you could do an ethnography where you were looking at social networks within a neighborhood to try to test a hypothesis about a way that networks can reduce inequality for children in poor neighborhoods. Or you could propose a randomized trial that would be based on some kind of housing voucher. In fact, I'm going to a meeting next week with several different foundations to hear from Raj Chetty about what programs he thinks should be carried out based on his neighborhood's effects, his reanalysis of the Moving to Opportunity research. But you have to propose some specific response. It's not what we typically, or at least not what I typically think of as neighborhood effects research, which is all about describing the nature and sources of inequality as opposed to responding to inequality. Does that answer your question?
So, yeah.
Great.
Is the foundation interested at all in graduate education inequalities?
Well, we focus age 5 to 25.
Right.
So to the extent that's within age, like law school, yes.
Okay.
PhD, marginal.
Okay.
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the new philanthropy, and you mentioned the differences between your approach and how some other foundations have taken a very different approach, and kind of why you've chosen the direction you have and how you view some of the proposed changes in philanthropy.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, we have supported 3 items in this. We supported Rick Hess and Jeff, what's his name, from Teachers College, Jeff Hennig's new book on the new education philanthropy. So we were one of the funders. We have supported in the past research by Sarah Rikow, and we're supporting an ongoing project by Sarah Rikow, which is, again, exactly on this question. The reason we've taken the position we have is that's the history of the William T. Grant Foundation. We're not an operating foundation. We're a grant-making foundation, and what we make grants for is to support research. Now, we do have a little bit of an operating side because we're trying to stir up interests in what we're interested in. We're trying to get more people to attack the problem that we think is fundamental. But we are not going to come with ideas about what the response is. So that's the reason that we've taken the stance we've taken. We've tried to we will team up with some of these other foundations who are more issue-oriented, like charter schools are the answer or technology is the answer. So we will try to co-opt some of those foundations into saying, look, charter schools are the answer, but as Ron and others have shown, variability is the real story of charter schools. And so how can we make charter schools better? Or how can we make all charter schools work like the best operating charter schools? That's the kind of thing that we might do jointly with some other foundation. Well, let me take, you're up, Ron.
I don't want to monopolize this, but to follow up on that, some foundations see it a benefit to have multiple foundations involved. I get the sense it's more bang for the buck, right?
Yeah.
For the investment. Does William T. Grant Foundation?
Yeah,
have-
that's a good question, and I believe my approach is somewhat different than my predecessor who collaborated importantly with the Spencer Foundation, but not more widely. And I'm interested in much broader range of collaboration for exactly the reason you mentioned. I think for a moderate-sized foundation like the William T. Grant Foundation, it's all about leverage. And I think there are three ways for us to gain leverage. One is high-impact grant making, so supporting work that has very large impact. Now, it's hard to know beforehand what study is going to be an incremental contribution and what's going to have a big impact. So, but we're aiming to have we're aiming high. Second, the second way to have leverage is by supporting the development of researchers. And so that's what the William T. Grant Scholars Program is all about. And then the third is by collaborating with other funders, many of whom have much deeper pockets than we do. And so sometimes we are the one applying the leverage, and sometimes we're the ones getting the leverage. But either way, as long as we stick to our fundamental interests, we are gaining leverage with others. So I have explored collaborations with a very large number of foundations, and I have active collaborations with Spencer, with Ford, with Russell Sage Foundation, just finished something with the Gates Foundation, and then there are many others that we've had conversations with. So I anticipate that and then we are supporting a national network of research practice partnerships, and we help to develop the support for it, and that involves Spencer, Gates, Spencer, Wallace, Annie E. Casey, and somebody else, another foundation. So we're very interested in doing these kind of things. Yep. Other questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah.
So one sort of dimension of social inequality that I'm sure you think a lot about, we didn't make it explicit here, but is the distinction between inequality in access versus outcomes?
Yes.
Right? And I'm curious if sort of your priorities, if you value sort of a stream of research that focuses on one rather than the other.
Well, certainly both are extremely important. And I'm going to take a step back first, and then I'll come back to your question. So inequality has many meanings. I talked about inequality with respect to group differences versus overall dispersion, but both of those have to do with distributional inequality. That is, some people have more, other people have less. There's another kind of inequality which some have called relational inequality, which has to do not with the resources you have at your disposal, but the power that you have. So inequality in power relations. And I think there's so we're very interested in supporting research on reducing relational inequality, as well as research reducing distributional inequality. So in part, differential access can be a matter of relational inequality rather than distributional inequality. To be more specific, though, we're certainly interested in both access and outcomes. When it comes to post-secondary education, that's where this topic is most often voiced. And you would have to show us in your application why access is the issue. Because as I've shown you, there's not a lot of inequality in access. Yes, it's like 90% of people from high income and 67% from low income getting access. But the real problem is in completion. Completion is where the gaps have been greatly exacerbated. So you would have to demonstrate in your proposal why inequality of access, why we need to challenge inequality of access. But if you could do that, we would certainly be interested in funding that. Yes, Gary.
And, thanks for the talk. I wanted to focus a little bit more on the research influence and kind of what you see that we're getting out of that. There's been a lot of interest and a lot of funding for partnerships and trying to describe the conditions under which these partnerships produce research that actually influences policies and practices.
Yes.
And so forth. I've got a big partnership grant right now, so I'm not a
With-
skeptic. Yes.
Oh, but who's your partner though?
The State Board of Education in North Carolina,
Ah, got it.
along with Rand and a couple others, but they're the policy
Yeah.
folks. But just are there lessons that are starting to come out that we should be attentive to in this work? Because I've seen, I guess I am somewhat skeptical that it is necessarily the nature of the relationships, and that the quality of the research, the rigor, because they advocates in that arena will first attack your methods, it seems to me, if it's in a policy versus a program arena. But I just wonder what you think we're starting to learn, and are partnerships a key part of the answer to this influence?
Well, so we think the answer is yes, and here's how we've arrived at that answer. I would stand by my claim that improving the quality of evidence is not only not sufficient, but not even necessary to see evidence use. However, taking your pushback, I would agree that improving the quality of evidence is necessary for good decisions to be made. So yeah, people might be likely to use evidence that's bad, but they wouldn't make good decisions then. So I'll grant you then that improving the quality of evidence is a necessary condition for making good decisions, but I would still maintain that it's not sufficient. So given that it's not sufficient, what else does it take? So it takes relationships of trust between consumers and producers. The idea is that there has to be a normative environment where decision makers routinely think of research evidence as one of the sources of evidence that they would like. It's never going to be decisive, because policy decisions are always made in a political context. But it is possible to develop a culture in which evidence is part of the decision-making process. So trusted relationships are a part of that. And I think we do have evidence from that. A couple places to look are a book edited by Kara Finnegan and Alan Daly called The Use of Research Evidence in Education. And then on our website, we've got a whole section on research practice partnerships with some academic papers that try to make this point. So then, stepping back from this then, well, what are we going to do to create those relationships? So it turns out you need some kind of structure. They're just not going to exist in the air. It needs some kind of structure. So research practice partnerships are the leading strategy to create those structures that can stabilize and institutionalize the relationships, and in fact make them outlive the specific individuals who may come and go. So that's why we regard research practice partnerships as a leading strategy to foster the use of research evidence, because they provide a structure for relationships to develop in which producers and consumers develop trust and are regularly interacting with one another. Researchers are led to pose questions whose answers will be of interest to decision makers, and decision makers will develop a norm of using evidence as part of their decision process. So that's the basis for our argument.
And do you have tests of that yet that show outcomes and show sustainability? Our grant with North Carolina, it comes right off the Race to the Top program. But they clearly said without a grant, we couldn't fund their part of this program, and so it really has made me wonder about sustainability.
Yeah. So I think there are two big gaps. The two big gaps are first in tests of how to create the conditions that foster use of evidence. So I think we have some knowledge of what those conditions are, but we don't have tests of how to create them. And the second gap is, as I mentioned earlier, testing the assumption that this actually produces better outcomes for young people. I don't think we have evidence of that. So we do have evidence that partnerships result in evidence use. And I think You can see papers from the Chicago Consortium, for example, that will demonstrate this. And some of the narratives in the Use of Research Evidence book that Finnegan and Daly edited will point to this. But whether that results in better outcomes for young people, I don't think anybody's ever attempted to test that. And we'd like to support some work that does that. Angela?
Yeah, so given the interest, this is a little bit off the research, but more on the effectiveness of programs and policies to reduce inequality. And then I was interested when you talked about implementation. And so is it a common component of this work to see these implementation studies?
I would say not common enough.
Yeah, it was occurring to me, like when I think of particular programs, so much of what needs to be learned there is in the implementation of those. And I wondered if that was...
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a major hole. The challenge of scaling up effective programs is pervasive across the social science literature. Education is certainly an area where it's a big challenge, and my own view is that not enough attention has been given to implementation. We have a grant, again, that we're recommending to our board, so I won't give any details about it, but hopefully in a month everybody will know about it, where it's testing a particular implementation challenge where, so let's say you have an intervention that relies on tutoring, one-on-one tutoring. And you have 10 tutors, each of whom is working with 10 kids, and you improve achievement for 100 kids, and maybe there are 100 control kids, and you've demonstrated effectiveness. Now you want to do it in a whole city, and there are 100 times as many kids, so you need 2,000 tutors. Well, it's one thing to get 22, or did I say 20? Well, whatever. Anyway, you get the idea. So that kind of geometric expansion in the personnel to implement the program probably means you're going to degrade the quality of the personnel. So what will it take then to get personnel, to get the 2000th tutor to be of equal quality as the 20th tutor? So a potential grantee is designed a study to look at that question. So that's the kind of implementation research that is necessary to answer questions about reducing inequality, and we'd love to fund more studies that look at those, that address those kind of issues. Anything else?
Got time for another question? Please join me in thanking Dr. Gamoran. Thank you.
Thank you.